They see it. That's the part that probably hasn't occurred to you yet, but it's true. They see exactly how well you're doing without them, and it lands differently than you'd expect, not as indifference, not as relief that you're fine so their conscience is clear and they can finally stop feeling guilty. It lands as regret, sharp and specific, the kind that shows up uninvited at the worst possible moments and refuses to leave quietly no matter how hard they try to push it down. You built this life after them, not because of them, and that distinction matters more than people give it credit for. Every piece of who you've become since, steadier, sharper, more sure of what you'll accept and what you won't tolerate anymore, happened on your own terms, in your own time, without their input or their permission, without them getting a single vote in how any of it turned out. And somewhere they're watching that unfold from a distance they created themselves, entirely by their own choices, and it's costing them more than they'll ever say out loud to you directly, more than they'd probably admit even to themselves on most days. There's a particular kind of discomfort that comes from watching someone flourish specifically after you, someone you assumed would struggle without the thing you provided, without the role you played in their life, without whatever support or structure you assumed was holding everything together. When that expectation doesn't hold up, when the person you left behind not only survives, but visibly builds something better, something they seem genuinely proud of, it forces a reckoning that's difficult to avoid, no matter how good someone is at avoiding difficult things generally, no matter how skilled they've become at deflecting and distracting themselves from anything uncomfortable. Quick pause before we get into this properly. Regret doesn't announce itself with fireworks, and it never has. It shows up small, in a song that plays unexpectedly in a grocery store, in a name mentioned casually by someone who doesn't know the history behind it, in a quiet moment right before sleep when the mind wanders somewhere it wasn't invited and didn't ask permission to go. That's when it hits them, not dramatically, not with any warning, just persistently, a low hum underneath an ordinary day that never quite goes away, no matter how busy they try to keep themselves. It arrives in the mundane, which is exactly what makes it so hard to shake off or reason away. A dramatic regret, tied to one specific identifiable moment, can eventually be processed and set aside with enough time and enough intention. But this kind, the kind that lives quietly in ordinary triggers scattered throughout an ordinary week, never fully clears because there's no single event to work through and move past, no clean endpoint to reach. It's just there, quietly, persistently, in the background of an otherwise normal life, resurfacing whenever something small and unexpected brings it forward again. They've started measuring other people against you without meaning to, and it's not something they can easily control anymore. It happens almost involuntarily at this point. Someone new says something, does something, and a comparison fires off before they can stop it or talk themselves out of it, and you win every time, without even being in the room to make your case. That's not nostalgia talking, and it's not some idealized, inflated memory of who you were. That's a real standard you set simply by being who you are, day to day, and nobody since has come close to matching it, no matter how hard they've tried to convince themselves otherwise, or how hard they've tried to convince other people they've moved on completely. They know, with total clarity now, that this was their doing, and not yours, no matter how the story got told at the time, or who ended up carrying the blame in other people's eyes. Whatever excuse felt convincing in the moment, whatever justification let them sleep at night back then, time has a way of stripping all of that down to what actually happened, layer by layer, until there's nothing left but the plain, unflattering truth. And what actually happened is they had something rare, something genuinely valuable, and didn't protect it the way it deserved to be protected. That knowledge doesn't fade with distance. If anything, it sharpens the further away they get from the moment it happened, the way most real regrets tend to do, rather than the way people hope they will. There's no version of this where they get to rewrite what happened into something more flattering for themselves, no matter how much time passes, or how convincingly they tell it to other people. People try, of course, reframing, minimizing, telling a version of events where they come across better than they actually behaved at the time. But underneath whatever story they've settled on for public consumption, the private version stays fully intact, and it's rarely kind to them when they're alone with it. That gap between the story they tell and the truth they know is its own quiet, ongoing discomfort. Your growth isn't a performance for their benefit, and that's exactly why it hits so hard when they see it play out from a distance. If you were thriving loudly, obviously, in a way clearly designed to be witnessed and to send a message, it would read as exactly that, a message aimed directly at them, something crafted for their reaction. But it isn't that, and it was never meant to be. You're simply living, fully and honestly, without them factored into the equation anymore in any way, and that complete absence of performance is what makes it so undeniable and so hard for them to dismiss. They're not watching a show put on for their benefit. They're watching someone move on completely, genuinely, without a single glance back in their direction. And there's no version of witnessing that which doesn't sting somewhere underneath whatever face they're putting on for everyone else. This is important to understand because it changes what you owe anyone watching. You don't need to soften your happiness to spare their feelings, and you don't need to perform sadness or struggle to make things easier for them to process either. Your life continuing to go well isn't cruelty. It's just the natural result of a person who kept moving forward instead of staying stuck in a story that had already ended. The silence you've kept has said more than any confrontation ever could have, and it's still saying it now, every single day it continues. You didn't need to explain yourself to them, didn't need to prove a point through a dramatic final speech, didn't need one last conversation to make absolutely sure they understood exactly what they lost when they lost you. You just kept living, quietly and consistently, and that silence became its own statement, louder in its absence than any confrontation could have ever managed to be, because words can be argued with, and silence simply can't. There's nothing to push back against in someone who never asked to be understood in the first place. Some people mistake silence for weakness, assuming that the person who doesn't say anything must not have much to say. In this case, it's the opposite. The silence isn't an absence of feeling. It's the presence of something stronger than the need to be heard by someone who already proved they wouldn't listen when it mattered most. They don't get to claim any part of who you've become, and this is worth sitting with directly, because it's easy to assume that growth after a loss is somehow shared credit, that they get to feel proud in some backwards, undeserved way of the person you turned into afterward, as if their absence was somehow a gift they gave you on purpose. They don't get that credit. You did that work entirely on your own, without a manual and without their guidance. The strength, the clarity, the higher standards, all of it is yours, built without their help, and often built in direct response to their absence, rather than because of anything they ever contributed while they were still around. It's worth being firm about this, even just internally, because there's a subtle narrative that sometimes creeps in, where people who caused pain start to feel entitled to some portion of the growth that pain produced. That entitlement isn't valid. Pain doesn't belong to the person who caused it just because growth eventually came out the other side of it. The growth belongs entirely to the person who did the work of surviving it and building something better afterward. You don't need their regret to validate anything about your life right now, and this is the part that matters most, honestly, more than anything else in this video. Knowing they regret it isn't the goal, and it was never supposed to be the finish line you were quietly working toward this whole time. You're not thriving to make a point to them or to prove them wrong about something they said or believed about you back then. You're thriving because that's simply who you are now, independent of whether they ever notice, ever admit it out loud, or ever say a single word about it to anyone, including themselves. This distinction matters because it protects you from a trap a lot of people fall into without realizing it, building a life that's secretly still oriented around someone else's reaction to it. If your thriving is ever contingent on them witnessing it, you've handed them power over your life again, even from a distance, even without them knowing it. Real thriving doesn't check to see if anyone's watching before it counts as real. Their regret tends to deepen with time, not fade, which surprises most people who've never actually lived through the losing end of a situation like this one. People often assume regret has a shelf life, that it softens naturally the further away you get from the original moment, the way most feelings tend to soften with distance, new experiences, and enough time layered on top of the original wound. Sometimes the opposite happens instead. As more time passes, and the version of you they lost keeps becoming clearer, more solid, more undeniably thriving in ways they can't argue with or dismiss, the weight of what they let go of only becomes heavier to carry, not lighter, because there's nothing new to distract from the comparison anymore. This is especially true if nothing since has come close to what they had with you, and deep down they already know it, even if they'd never say it out loud to another living person. Every new attempt at something similar just becomes another data point confirming what they already suspected, that what they lost wasn't ordinary, wasn't replaceable, and wasn't something they were going to find again just by trying harder with someone new, no matter how much effort they put into convincing themselves otherwise along the way. Some of them will reach out eventually, and some won't, and neither outcome changes anything about where you already stand or what you've already built. If they do reach out, it's rarely about you specifically, no matter how it's framed or how sincere it sounds in the moment. It's usually about them trying to quiet something uncomfortable that's been building for a while, something they've been carrying that finally got too heavy to keep carrying alone in silence. You get to decide entirely on your own terms and in your own timing whether that conversation is even worth having, and you don't owe anyone access to your life just because they've finally noticed, months or years later, exactly what they lost. If you do decide to respond, it doesn't need to be an emotional event, and it doesn't need to give them anything they haven't already earned back through actual effort. It can be brief, measured, and entirely on your terms, without any obligation to give them the closure or the reassurance they might be hoping to get out of it. Their regret is theirs to sit with entirely on their own time without your help. It was never your job to help them feel better about the choices they made, and it still isn't now, no matter how much time has passed since. You were never the problem they made you out to be, even in the moments you doubted that yourself, even in the nights you replayed everything trying to find the version of events where it was somehow your fault. Whatever story got told at the time, whatever blame got placed unfairly in your direction by people who didn't have the full picture, you know by now, with the clarity that only real distance gives a person, that it was never really about you at all. It was about what they weren't ready for, weren't capable of, or weren't willing to do, even when it mattered most, even when you gave them every reasonable chance to show up differently. That's theirs to carry entirely, not yours, and it never was, no matter how convincingly it was framed otherwise at the time. It's worth releasing whatever residue of self-blame might still be sitting quietly underneath all of this, even now, even after everything you've already worked through and moved past. Growth doesn't require you to keep revisiting an old verdict that was wrong to begin with, over and over, as if repeating the exercise might eventually change the outcome. You're allowed to simply set that story down permanently and stop checking whether it's still true, because it wasn't true then, and it isn't true now, and it never will be, no matter how many times it gets replayed. There's a particular kind of quiet pride that comes from realizing your happiness doesn't require their absence to have meaning, or their return to feel complete, or their acknowledgement to make it official. A lot of people, without meaning to, keep a small part of themselves waiting for the other person to catch up, to finally see what they lost, as though that recognition would somehow complete the story or make everything that happened worth it in some final, satisfying way. It won't, and it doesn't need to. Your story is already complete without their chapter needing a proper ending written by them, and it was complete long before they ever came around to seeing it clearly. Notice too how much lighter you've become since the version of you who used to check for their reaction to everything, big and small, important and completely trivial. There was a time, maybe, when a part of you wondered what they'd think of a decision, an outfit, a choice you made about your own life, your own future, your own happiness, before you'd even fully decided how you felt about it yourself. That checking has mostly stopped by now, hasn't it, without you even consciously deciding to let it go? That's not something small. That's the actual measure of how far you've come, not the visible achievements everyone can see from the outside, but the quiet internal absence of needing their approval for any of it anymore. Mutual friends carry pieces of this story back and forth sometimes, whether either side asked for that or not, whether it's welcome or not on either end. A comment here, an update there, small fragments that eventually find their way to both sides of a situation neither person fully controls anymore, no matter how much distance either of you has tried to put between yourselves and the people who used to connect you both. If word has made its way back to you about how they've been since, about what they've said, about how they've reacted to hearing about your life, take it lightly. It's information, not an invitation, and you don't owe it a reaction either way, positive or negative, no matter how tempting it might be to react. There's no timeline you're required to follow with any of this, no deadline by which you're supposed to have fully stopped thinking about any of it either, no correct pace at which you're supposed to be moving through whatever's left to process. Healing isn't a straight line, and neither is watching someone else's regret unfold from a distance you can feel even without direct contact. Some days this won't cross your mind at all, and it'll feel like it belongs entirely to a past version of your life you barely recognize anymore. Other days it might surface unexpectedly, out of nowhere, and that's not a setback or a sign you haven't healed enough. That's just what it looks like to be a person who lived through something real and came out the other side of it whole, carrying the memory without being controlled by it.